It's time to talk about some Bears football again. Say it with me. You know you've missed it. Inject it straight into your arms, they say. Bears football. Oh, God. 2020 was almost peak. Peak. Bears football. Because there was this weird dynamic heading into that whole year. Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy should have been fired after 2020. You should have already been able to see the signs. You should also know the only reason that they weren't was because of the cheapness of Phillips and McCaskey, Goofy George, yuck, and Bean Counting Ted. They didn't want to have to pay off multiple years of contracts for guys that weren't going to be there anymore. That's all that was. Especially coming off of a COVID year where you didn't have fans in the stands. They couldn't absorb that financial hit. So you knew these two assholes were lame ducks heading into 2021. You just had to know it. I mean, only a frickin' fool would have thought that Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace should be brought back. And then, on top of that, being even more delusional, thinking that this season would be a success, that those two would be a success. But plenty of delusions there. Maybe less so about Matt Nagy. It felt like Bears fans were generally aligned that he sucked. But even up until the time that Ryan Pace was hired, you still had people trying to defend Ryan Pace. And there were no defenses. You were just wrong. 7 years, 2 playoff appearances, 0 playoff wins. That's the resume. I don't give a shit what you think about some of his day 3 draft picks. He fucking sucked. Fire his ass. Like, it just speaks to the perpetual cycle of the mediocrity of the McCaskey way that has permeated every level of the Chicago Bears franchise and every level of Chicago Bears fandom, that people would even be debating this. That, my friends, is Bears football in a nutshell. So, of course, naturally, you let a GM that's on the hot seat, a lame duck, a head coach that's on the hot seat, a lame duck, bring in a rookie quarterback into that situation because that's what you want to fucking do. So poor Justin Fields, they make the big move to move up from 20 to 11 in the draft to get him, and they bring him into this environment. So, of course, it only makes sense that these clowns naturally start Andy Dalton on day 1 because, again, that's what dumb dicks do. The only thing that really mattered above all else, well, there were 2 things that mattered most about 2021. Number 1 was Justin Fields' development. That was priority number 1. Taking away starts from him because you wanted to play Andy Dalton does not help his development. And anybody who thinks that Justin Fields will learn more by sitting than starting is a fucking idiot and should not be taken seriously. Seriously. And number 2, the only other thing that mattered about this season was counting down the days until Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy were both shown the frickin' door. That was it. That's all you had to look for this season. Ironically, though, they were actually 3-2 at one point in time, believe it or not, after that win over the Raiders. They were 3-2. Now, you knew they weren't very good. You knew they were getting lucky in some spots, but 3-2 is 3-2. But look at how they finished the season. They finished 6-11. That means they went 3-9 the rest of the way. The wheels came falling off the caboose pretty damn quickly. Because why? Bears football! The offense sucked. Bears football! The Desai defense was mildly to wildly overrated by the fans and media. Bears football! Just a massive, ginormous waste of time of a season. And even when it became obvious the team was eliminated from playoff contention, you knew you were going to fire these assholes anyways. To not do that with a couple of weeks to go left in the regular season, meaning you could start your searches for head coach and general manager early, clown school shit. Bears football! The fact that there was still even discussion like in that week leading up to the last game that, everybody's pretty sure that Matt Nagy's gone, but they're not sure what's going to happen with Ryan Pace. Bears football! And then they finally fire the two. And then you see like Bill Polian's on the committee. Oh, we're doing the Ernie Accorsi bullshit again. Yeah. But thankfully, the season ended. And thankfully, Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy were shown the door. It had to happen. It needed to happen. It must happen. Because you weren't going to do shit with these guys. That time had long since come and gone. It really had. So in this offseason, the Bears' next new era has started with the hiring of new general manager Ryan Poles and new head coach Matt Eberflus. Interesting that the guy from Kansas City hired a guy from Indianapolis, bringing in a head coach that was a defensive coordinator for a team that didn't even make the playoffs in 2021. I'm just saying. Also interesting, as so much of the rest of the league went with an offensive-minded head coach, here go the Bears hiring a defensive-minded guy. Bears football! Firing a Ryan at general manager and a Matt at head coach to replace them with a Ryan at general manager and a Matt at head coach. Bears football! If I didn't know any better, I would put on my Q Baranon hat and I would say, it's probably because they only have first names on the nameplates at Hallis Hall, and Bean Count Ted was so fucking cheap that they wanted to hire guys with the same first name so that way they could reduce expenses. They didn't even have to change the damn nameplates. It's a Q Baranon hat, I got you, but, I mean, would it surprise you? But of course, Ted Phillips is still involved with the organization. That's the other big news, but George McCaskey is actually overseeing the day-to-day operations, yet somehow Ted Phillips is still allowed to be involved in the organization after 2 decades of massive failure. Oh, we're going to put him in charge of the stadium stuff. Because that worked out so well 20 years ago, right? The hell's wrong with you assholes? Goofy George. Oh, yuck, gosh. If Ted Phillips did a better job with the stadium deal 2 decades ago, you wouldn't be looking for one in Arlington Heights now. Anyways. Back to what was the single most important thing about this season. And that was the development of Justin Fields. What's the verdict on him after his rookie year? The only correct answer is undetermined. If anybody tells you he's a future stud or anybody tells you he's a massive bust, they're wrong. Because we did not see enough to indicate he's a future star. We did not see enough to feel complete confidence that he will be a franchise-level quarterback in the NFL. Like, you may want it to happen. You want to believe in it. You feel it. But that doesn't make it so. You also didn't see enough out of him to say he's a total bust. No. You saw some bad games and some bad moments, but you'll see that from any rookie quarterback in general. But that's part of the problem, is there's some reason for optimism with his athleticism and arm talent that's displayed at key times. Like, you look, I think one of the banner performances for him in 2021 was that Monday night game against Pittsburgh. But I think there's also some reason for concern. You know, the starts that he had this year, he only had 4 games where he threw for over 200 yards passing. You know, now you're bringing in a defensive-minded head coach to work with a young, quarterback. Like, how is that dynamic going to work? Then you're also talking about the fact that Justin Fields didn't play several games due to Matt Nagy's incompetence, but also a couple of assorted injuries here and there. Is Justin Fields going to be able to avoid big hits and be protected well enough to where he's actually going to be able to play 17-game seasons? And I still saw some things from time to time in terms of his mechanics, in terms of his inability to quickly react to what he sees that I saw in college. That still concerns me. So that's what's really weird about this, is so much is left to be determined about Justin Fields. We just don't know. It would have been great if you said, hey, Justin Fields looks like he's the dude. But you cannot say that right now. Like, with a straight face, you cannot 100% say that with actual factual supporting evidence. You can say that with a belief or a want to, but the want to, the belief, doesn't make it so. And that's the thing to me, is like, you go out there, you hire this general manager who then hires a defensive-minded head coach, which is going to result in some form of structural change in their defense, thinking similar to what Indianapolis runs. So not only do the Bears need to invest massively on the offensive side of the ball now, they're going to have to invest some on the defensive side of the ball too in order to be able to run Eberflus's scheme. Interesting choice is what I will say for now. But when you look at this team, certainly there are needs on the defensive side of the ball. Let's be clear. Especially if you're switching to a base 4-3, although you could talk about how much do you really run a base look, and is that somewhat overrated? It is. It absolutely is. But you look at philosophically, the things that you do, those do matter. And you could see, like, Robert Quinn and Khalil Mack, if you keep both of them, potentially translate very well to Eberflus's defense. But is Roquan Smith going to stay inside, or is he going to play a Darius Leonard-Will linebacker type of role, which is what you would think or what you would envision. But then does that create a need at inside linebacker and middle linebacker? You know, you've got Jalen Johnson at one corner, but who's corner two? Like, are you really that confident in Thomas Graham Jr. that you're going to let a 6th-round pick from this year who hardly played be the number 2 guy going into training camp? And does he really fit Eberflus's defensive philosophy? Lots of questions here. And that's just on the defensive side of the ball. I'm not even get to the offense. But the offense has to be the focus. And the offense has to be addressed in this offseason in a big way. It has to be. Now, you could also address it by saying, hey, David Montgomery, do you really want to give him big money? You know, like, what's the right level that you'd be willing to invest in him? If it's anything more than $9 or $10 million a year, maybe you trade him now and get some type of draft pick capital. And that's a challenge, too, for general manager Ryan Poles, is because Ryan Pace was such an incompetent fuckstick that his team consistently did not have enough draft pick capital. So now he comes into the situation with a quarterback that you're not quite sure about and limited draft pick capital in his first draft. Yeehaw. Enjoy. Certainly wide receiver is going to be a big need. Darnell Mooney's a keeper, but what else you got? You really going to try and bring back Allen Robinson? Nah, we good. So you're going to need at least 2 wide receivers, and you may address it in free agency, but some Bears fans might look at a guy like Chris Godwin or Mike Williams and think that's the target. I might look at somebody like a Cedric Wilson from Dallas and say there's a reasonable target that you could get at a somewhat reasonable price that might actually fit your offense pretty well. That would be a really good number 3 option. But they got to find a franchise receiver as well, and maybe that comes via the draft. And the second round looks like it's a place where you could get a guy that has wide receiver 1 potential. As far as the offensive line, they have several needs there. Are you really confident in Tevin Jenkins being the long-term answer at left tackle? Are you really? Are you willing to risk Justin Fields' physical status and future on that? Everybody on this offense, to be clear, everybody is replaceable. Everybody on this team is potentially replaceable for the right scenario, the right situation, the right circumstance. But they need to address that offensive line in multiple ways. That is at specifically left tackle, or if you say right tackle, I don't give a shit. Like, you got to address tackle. You got to address center. Obviously, that's the single biggest need on this offensive line, and that's absolutely true. But you got to figure out what you're going to do with James Daniels. Like, how much is he really worth? How much do you really want to pay him? And could you draft somebody that could do similar things for a fraction of the price? But even if you do keep James Daniels, like, you figure you might want to move on from Whitehair in a year or so, might need to draft another guard. There should be a heavy investment on the trenches in this draft. Like, there were certain criminal deficiencies in this roster thanks to incompetent Ryan Pace. Offensive line and offensive line depth was certainly one of them. So this team needs to invest heavily in the offensive line, which is something you would expect to see. Probably big investment in both the offensive and defensive line in this offseason between free agency and the draft, and that's how it should be. You need some skill talent, too. They need some help in that secondary, both at corner and safety, that is for sure. But number 1 priority is this offense. This is where the investment has to be, because that's where your future is. That's where your future will be. You've got to help out Justin Fields. You've got to protect him better. You got to stop playing Bears football and play an offensive-first philosophy that more closely aligns with what teams do in the 21st century in the NFL.